be hearing from Mike Steger, who also heads up the Schiller Institute in the San Francisco Bay Area. But before we get going here, because we obviously have a lot to discuss, there was a very momentous trip by Donald Trump over to Asia in general, but especially the red carpet, so to speak, was rolled out for him in China. And that's on the heels of the president of China, Xi Jinping, and others around him, around the 19th CPC Congress, the Communist Party Congress. They actually put something that the Schiller Institute, our organization, has been fighting for about 25 years, which we at the time called a New Silk Road, and is today known in China as the One Belt, One Road, or Chinese Yi Dai Yi Lu. And so that was actually inserted into as an amendment into the platform. So I want to read that part just to give a sense of that. So this is as part of the CPC, the Congress agrees to include into the party constitution the following statements. I won't read all of the statements, but in terms of the one that discusses the Belt and Road Initiative, it says that they seek a strong sense of community for the Chinese nation, to uphold justice while pursuing shared interests, work to build a community with a shared future for mankind, follow the principle of achieving shared growth through discussion and collaboration, and pursue the Belt and Road Initiative. So this is very significant to have something that could have been seen as a big project or a big idea actually be put forward really for generations to come in terms of this being put into the Constitution. So soon thereafter was the trip by Donald Trump to Asia, and the media isn't really giving the full gravity of the potential that was created with that, so Mike will definitely get into that. So I think there's a lot to discuss, and maybe just perhaps before I introduce Mike, I would like to thank Nanhai for sponsoring this event, and also the Bellevue Chinese Chamber of Commerce for providing some of the refreshments and generally being supportive of bringing this concept, which a lot of Americans don't know very much about, in terms of the One Belt, One Road. But that this is also not something that is across the water, but that we intend that this be for the world as a whole, in terms of that the New Silk Road becomes a world land bridge, if you will. So we have some material in the back that people can check out. We also have subscriptions to a daily intelligence journal that we put out called the Executive Intelligence Review Daily Alert, and I would encourage everybody to subscribe to that. You can meet some of our representatives over at the table after Mike gives his presentation. So perhaps I'll just turn it over to Mike.
Okay, thanks. Can people hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to not use this and then see if that works. Okay, so yeah, can you hear me okay?
They don't hear you.
How about in the back? Okay.
But I think she wants you to use the mic.
Oh, okay. So so let me introduce myself a little bit. I work with the Schiller Institute. That's an organization set up. You want to? Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So I work with the Schiller Institute. I have for about 15 years. Dave and I have been colleagues for a long time with the Lyndon and Helga Zepp LaRouche. And I'm going to cover a little bit of that. But I just took my first trip to China in September. I was part of the People's Daily, as people probably know, is a major newspaper in China, government-backed. They hold a forum every year since the Belt and Road was initiated. So this was their 4th year. It was the largest conference. It was the first time it was held outside of Beijing. It was actually out in Gansu province, far western Gansu province, but near the Mogao caves in this area. But what was distinct about it, about the conference, was that China is becoming far more assertive and confident, and what they're doing is incredibly successful. The second thing that I saw from China, as being, I'm 40 years old here, so and I'll get a little bit more into the context of that in the United States, I haven't seen a society with a real mission since I've been alive. You can maybe disagree if you want to, but when I talk to my parents' generation, and they talk about what John Kennedy was doing, what we were doing with the space program in the United States, there was a sense of coherence, a sense of mission, a sense of accomplishing something wonderful, great, significant. And today, I don't see that in the United States. And I think many of you are here because the topic of the discussion tonight is the pending financial crisis. And I'll get into perhaps some of that, and maybe we'll get into more of it with the discussion. So now what I experienced in China was largely a sense of it. A sense of the Chinese is that there's a real mission orientation. They know what they're accomplishing is significant. It's a real, tangible sense. It's as Xi Jinping, the president of China, says, it's a Chinese dream. So each individual member of China has a dream of what they want to accomplish. But that's associated with what their nation's going to accomplish. And in a certain way, which is very distinct, it's what their nation's going to contribute. And there is. Some of these words, and many Americans are cynical. I was there with a lot of Western journalists. The cynicism of the journalists from the West it's stunning in comparison to what you see in China. Chinese are far more accepting of technology. They're far more trusting of technology than many people in the West are. I mean, the cynicism of the West, it's almost a casual cynicism. And I'm going to touch on some of these subjects a little bit more in depth. So if it seems a little off topic, you'll see what its relevance later. But that was a very striking difference for an American who was very engaged in U.S.-China policy and the development of a development program globally, which is what the Belt and Road is, to see the cultural difference. But the thing about the Belt and Road that's important for people, I think, to realize, even within this audience, and for many Americans, as Dave said, they know very little about this. I would say, honestly, the greatest national security problem we have is not if President Trump is talking to President Putin, it's that the American people don't know what's happening in China today. That's our biggest national security risk. Because not because of a possible war with China, because what's happening in China and what the Belt and Road represents is so important for the policies needed in the United States, the development orientation of infrastructure, some of these basic questions. But the Belt and Road was not imagined to be economically fruitful by many, even in China. How many people think that's true? That even in China, many people didn't think that investing tons of money, hundreds of billions of dollars, into places like Pakistan or Kazakhstan or Kenya was going to be economically and financially successful. Right? It's not necessarily obvious. Many people in China, when we engaged in the discussion with them in the early 1990s, saw that there was an importance to developing the western or interior parts of China. Along the coast, there had been much development, the opening up of Deng Xiaoping. But the western parts had not been developed. Plus, there are security risks. You've got certain, obviously, Central Asia has many military and political problems. So many in China recognized we had to address the poverty in Western China, and you had to address security issues. There's also questions of, say, securing fuel and energy from the Middle East that China would be concerned about. These would be reasons to invest. But they didn't imagine that it would become the foundation for a new global paradigm. They didn't think it would be the foundations for a new international economic system. And it very quickly has. This project is now endorsed by the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Almost every major international institution has to identify they're investing into the largest water infrastructure project in the world today in Africa. It will transform the area of areas like Mali, Sudan, Chad, and this area in the southern Sahara region of Africa. There are massive projects on every continent, on South America, all over Asia, in Europe. So, but this is what our organization recognized would be the case. We recognized it would be a new international economic system as a foundation. Now, I just want to say that to introduce some of the context. And what I'd like to do, I imagine this audience, to some degree, followed President Trump's trip to China. How many people saw footage of that or watched it on YouTube or some of the speeches? Okay. Okay, I'll slow down a little bit, yeah. This is from one of his speeches in China, just to kind of capture the tone. Because how many people think the American media covered that trip well? Okay, 0, right. Okay. Okay, this is why we have a national security problem, as I said. This is Trump, this is President Trump speaking in China. Yesterday we visited the Forbidden City, which stands as a proud symbol of China's rich culture and majestic spirit. Your nation is a testament to thousands of years of vibrant, living history. And today, it was a tremendous honor to be greeted by the Chinese delegation right here at the Great Hall of the People. This moment in history presents both our nations with an incredible opportunity to advance peace and prosperity alongside other nations all around the world. In the words of a Chinese proverb, we must carry forward the cause and forge ahead into the future. I'm confident that we can realize this wonderful vision, a vision that will be so good and in fact so great for both China and the United States. So we come from different places in faraway lands. There is much that binds the East and West. Both our countries were built by people of great courage, strong culture, and the desire to trek across the unknown into great danger, which they overcame. The people of the United States have a very deep respect for the heritage of your country and the noble traditions of its people. Your ancient values bring past and future together into the present so beautifully. It is my hope that the proud spirits of the American and Chinese people will inspire our efforts to achieve a more just, secure, and peaceful world. A future worthy of the sacrifices of our ancestors and the dreams of our children. Now, how many people think that reflects the American media's image of Donald Trump today in the United States? It's almost like it's like schizophrenia. There's no way that Donald Trump that Americans think they have as president. And obviously he's a wild guy, I'm not. But that kind of relationship. Now, people here may understand the significance of this, the importance of China and what's happening. How many people here have been to China?
Pardon?
Have you been to China before?
Have I what?
Been to China.
Just Hong Kong and Taiwan.
Okay, all right. That counts, according to most people. China, under President Bush, under President Obama, and under the Western political system, the idea of any nation challenging U.S. superiority was a cause for war. So nations like Russia, as we see today, nations like China, were considered a threat. And that was a very serious problem. At the same time, that political establishment pushed a very clear economic agenda for the world. British free trade. British free trade uber alles. Meaning that, take the Trans-Pacific Partnership that President Trump canceled. That was going to give corporations, private corporations, the ability to sue nations in international courts. That's a crazy idea, that somehow you can have corporations suing nations for changing their laws to defend their population. So President Trump in this trip with China has embraced China's growth and development entirely. He's embraced the growth of Asia entirely. And he's shattered the entire free trade orientation that has existed for practically 70 years. Extremely so in the last 25 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. That's a pretty remarkable trip. Because China's growth, as Dave just indicated, is not something, there's a lot of concern. A lot of the Westerners talk about China's financial system is going to blow soon. You know, China just set up a new institution. It's an oversight committee, a financial oversight committee that is above all other financial oversight committees. And the speculation from the West was, oh, this is because China's housing bubble is about to blow, or China's growth and debt levels are about to break. How many people think that the reason China set up a major financial oversight committee? And if you answer well, I've got Ben Bridges. This is the endorsement of Nanhai. I've got discount certificates for those who answer right. How many people think China set up a major financial oversight committee because of China's internal financial problems?
Pardon me?
How many people think they set up a major financial oversight committee because of problems in the Western financial system? Yeah, right? It's obvious that would be the case. So, now in addition to the philosophical nature and policy nature of Trump's trip, in the context of the events that have unfolded, I could say a lot more, but I want to keep my comments brief and have some discussion. Trump also signed over $300 billion worth of deals mostly with China, and 50 billion with other nations, 250 billion with China. You know, $84 billion out of that 250, so a third of all the trade deals that Trump signed with China are going to one state in the United States.
Washington?
No. You wish.
Wisconsin.
Alaska.
Alaska was 43 billion. 84 billion is a different state. I'll give one more chance and you get a Ben Bridges $100 discount.
California.
Nope.
Florida?
Florida, nope. West Virginia. West Virginia. How many people here have been to West Virginia? Oh, wow, okay. So, West Virginia is probably the poorest state in the United States. And it's also where Franklin Roosevelt consolidated his presidential election. Probably the greatest American president in the 20th century. It's where John Kennedy secured his presidential election. And $84 billion over 20 years. That's a lot of money. $84 billion to Wall Street when they're just printing money every day is nothing. $84 billion to a bunch of poor coal miners is a lot of money. It's an investment not into real estate. It's an investment not into financial speculation or bonds or stocks or debt. It's an investment into real physical production. Now, unfortunately, most of the production is in fuel, fracking, natural gas, oil pipelines, in food, beef, other kinds of productions from Montana, and some other chemical areas, and military supply. We're not selling that. We're not selling that to China, but that's all the United States can sell. We can sell fuel, we can sell food, and we can sell military equipment. That's all we really have to sell. Or we can bring in Wall Street. You can bring Wall Street in. But we don't produce much in this country. So what we can produce, we are clearly creating trade deals in that regard. And this is going to go to building roads. It's going to be to fixing some of the infrastructure, building up some of the railroads. There's discussion in California of the Chinese coming in. A whole consortium of the top rail companies in China have met with the governor's office I'm sure the same is true in Washington. There's probably at least 2 to 3 dozen state governors who are lined up right now to be the next West Virginia. So even Donald Trump himself said that $250 billion or $300 billion total of trade deals will probably triple within the coming weeks to $1 trillion. And we know that that really is just the tip of the iceberg. That these states, these state governors, whether it be California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Michigan, Wisconsin, all over the Midwest, Ohio, Pennsylvania, they're clamoring for this investment. And Donald Trump, unlike Obama, has basically said, it's wide open. Go ahead. And that is a fundamental change. It's very, very important. It's not what we need it to be, but you could certainly say it's a foot in the door. A very important foot in the door, as we say. Now, there's some other things I could say on that, but let me kind of touch on now the subject of the nature of the discussion as it was advertised, because it is an important question and it's on many people's minds. This coming financial crisis. How many people think that there's another financial crisis in the near future? Okay, you're here, so it's somewhat obvious. How many people think we addressed the problem in 2008 effectively in any way? Anyone think we addressed it effectively? Okay. Now, we have a friend of ours who is the former Japanese director of the IMF. And he had friends who committed suicide in Japan in 97, 98. Because Japan's banking system went under. And the Japanese tradition, to save your family's honor, you kill yourself. And he was incredibly saddened. Now, they were threatened with prison. And some of them went to prison. And so after 97, he thought that maybe they were too harsh. They were too harsh in their judgment against some individuals, when it was really a systemic problem. When it's the whole system. How can you really hold individuals accountable when everybody is doing it and the entire political class knows they're doing it and doesn't do anything? Well, then he saw the 2008 crisis, and we didn't hold one banker accountable. And what happened? We bailed them out. We gave them all, we basically, with taxpayer bailouts of trillions of dollars, and they've just gone back and done the same thing 10 times over. The coming crisis will be 10 times the magnitude of the 2008 one. And the 2008 crisis was 10 times the magnitude of the 97, 98, 2000 crisis. So, which is not surprising. So it's major, it's massive. Now, how will it play out? I have no idea, but I can tell you that in Europe today, junk bonds, meaning worthless bonds, junk debt, which would usually sell at 20% interest rate return, are selling at 0%. Because you're actually holding some kind of bond that someone's supposed to pay you. Because in Europe today, they've just legalized, again, the same types of securities that were like the mortgage-backed securities of the 2008 crisis. Everything is fully legitimate again. The entire racket is wide open all over again. And Obama's Dodd-Frank did nothing to solve the problem. So debt levels, corporate debt levels, at the same ratio as they were in 2007. Household debt ratios, the same. Student loan debts, as high as ever. Car debts, as high as ever. The level of debt saturating the Western system is nearly inconceivable. You could probably say it's approximating 800, 600, to be conservative, $600 trillion. That's a conservative estimate of debt levels of the Western financial system today by the Bank of International Settlements. I would probably say it's over a quadrillion. It's 1,000 trillion. In nominal debt values in areas of derivatives, the securitization of instruments, these kinds of basically funny money. Yeah.
And you say Western means American, Europe, or?
Yes, the transatlantic, so largely dominated by European and American banks. Yeah. Centered in London and Wall Street predominantly. Now the question you have to ask, so I could go more into depth, but I don't want to beat a dead horse, and it's certainly a dead horse. People have seen that there's an old famous, it's not that old, but it's kind of an old famous Hollywood movie called Weekend at Bernie's. And this guy, this old rich guy dies, but he can't, I don't actually know the plot that well, but I know the nature of it. The guy dies, but they have to pretend that he's alive. So they have a big party at his house, and they prop him up in a chair, and they put a hat on his head, and they put a beer, and they just pretend he's drunk, like he's passed out drunk all weekend. That's kind of like the Western financial system. And they're printing money nonstop. The entire last 9-10 years. They've been bailing out and keeping the system primed. As you know, 0% interest rates. The Federal Reserve, even when the Federal Reserve in the last, I think they've raised it once in the last 10 years. They've raised the interest rate once, 0.25%. Literally, within like 6 hours, within that single day of trading, the actual market value already took it back down. They can't even try to raise the rates. Because if they raise the rates on the debt, when you try to borrow again to pay off your old debt, it risks blowing out the system. Everything is that fragile. And the debt levels have grown 10 times what they were, or approximately what they were in 2008, but it's magnitudes worse for the population. So, but to not just be redundant about that, the question is, why did that happen? Why would a society, if you took an individual and they did something absolutely crazy for like a decade, say drug addiction, and then they clearly crashed and were about to die, had to go to the hospital, they were in a coma, had to be rejuvenated. When they walked out of that hospital, they immediately went back to the drug addiction. You have to recognize something's wrong with that. There's something wrong in that person's identity. Now, of course, to be a drug addict, I already told you something was wrong. But if you're not the drug addict, if you're the parent of that person, or the friend, and you let them go back to doing drugs again, there's something wrong with you. Or your family. If your family lets a person do that, there'll be something wrong. You have to say, what's wrong with this family? Why do they keep letting this person do this? So if we're going to be honest about why this financial crisis has happened, and you have to look at the culture we're living in, the society we're living in. People are familiar with the Cultural Revolution in China from 1966 to 1976. How many people are familiar with the Cultural Revolution in the United States, starting approximately in 1968? How many people are familiar with the Cultural Revolution that took place in the United States in 1968? Yeah, a few people are. But it's not really commonly talked about, is it? What if the Cultural Revolution of 1966 in China was still going on? Would China be successful today?
No.
If China was where it was today and started a cultural revolution, where would China be in 30 years? Or 50 years? Would China continue what they're doing?
No.
If China began to promote a culture of selfish greed as the basis for economic success, would China continue doing what it's doing? If China started to promote drug use, recreational drug use, or kind of a relaxed sexual culture, just kind of a population reduction policy, well, and that's a little bit more sensitive in China, but they realize now they have to grow it, don't they? But in the 1968, what was launched in the United States was this kind of cultural revolution. And it has affected the entire society. Now, I was telling Dave, I might not touch on this subject 2 months ago, but I stand here today in a society which is what's on the news practically every night.
Opiate addiction.
Say it again?
Guns.
What did you guys say?
Shootings and drugs.
Somebody said opiates.
Opiates? Okay. I wish that was on the news every night. It's probably not.
Well,
People know
on
about
blocks
it.
it is, but
Yeah, somewhat.
yeah.
Somewhat. What did you say, Matt?
Gunshot.
Guns, right? The guns, the violence. How about sexual harassment? Anybody heard about
Yeah.
sexual?
Yeah.
Like, it's almost, it's everywhere. I mean, George H.W. Bush was accused. Senator Al Franken was accused. I mean, it's everybody.
There's another one that just came out. I just
Yeah.
on my phone.
Yeah, it's you get it. Like every hour you find out somebody else is now accused. And literally, Harvey Weinstein, this guy was a kingmaker. This guy was a kingmaker in Hollywood. And his career was gone overnight. Kevin Spacey was a darling of Hollywood. Career gone. Netflix, contracts, shows, movies, gone. The United States Senate set up a $15 million fund to pay people off who were accusing senators of sexual harassment. And they set up that $15 million fund with taxpayer money.
Yeah. I just heard that today.
I know.
And you'd think I was making this up. But that's what happened with the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. People said, just do what you feel. If it feels good, do it. That literally is a slogan I grew up with. My friends' parents told them that. If it feels good, do it. That's how their parents, that's how my parents' generation, not mine, mine were a little bit more conservative, but thus I'm standing here today. But my friends' parents, that was oftentimes their motto. People have grown up this way. So if you're in Wall Street, who saw the Wolf of Wall Street movie with Leonardo DiCaprio? That wasn't hyperbole, was it? That was actually happening. And what the guy describes is massive orgies inside the offices of Wall Street banks. Sexual orgies, massive drug use, on the counter of your bathroom at your bank doing cocaine lines. Now they say that was back in the 1980s. Yeah, right. Go to the strip clubs on southern Manhattan on a Friday night, and you'll see the same Wall Street bankers at J.P. Morgan at those strip clubs doing coke rails or popping opioid pills. That's the culture we live in. The culture of sex in Washington is nothing new to any of us that know Washington. The sex culture in Hollywood is nothing new to anybody that knows anything about Hollywood. That's just Hollywood. But it became the entire culture. It became totally acceptable just to do whatever you want to do, and yet you would act like you were a good person on the front. No wonder Americans are so angry. Because no one's taken concern for the long-term future of the country. Now, some people clearly have. Our organization, the LaRouche organization, the Schiller Institute, has been a clear, important part of this. We've fought this. Mr. LaRouche set up this organization specifically during the 1960s to combat that cultural destruction. And the Schiller Institute specifically promotes a culture of man which is based on beauty. You know, it was very interesting. Xi Jinping's speech at the 19th Congress talked about making China beautiful, a beautiful culture. That's something unique. It implies a renaissance. So if we're going to address this financial crisis, which is pending, it could happen this month. It could happen at the beginning of the year. It's certainly not a question of if, it is a question of when. And I don't have a crystal ball, I can't give you stock advice on when it's going to happen and how. But we certainly know that the solution is not simply changing some financial structures. And I'm going to go through a few of those in a second, because there are some specific financial structures that if we change them in a certain way, they will perfectly coincide with what China is doing to build the Belt and Road. But clearly it's a cultural shift. And the culture of Asia today versus the culture of the transatlantic. Remember, Donald Trump first went to Saudi Arabia, then to Israel, and then to Europe in his first major trip overseas. You know, the major discussion in the transatlantic politically is, should we have transgender bathrooms? In Germany, they're identified now a third sex, not male, not female, and that the parents can choose if they want their child identified as not female and not male. This is a bit absurd, right? It's philosophically and scientifically absurd. What's the questions of Asia? Growth, development, infrastructure, ending terrorism. The orientation of the transatlantic for the last 50 years has been depopulation. The population growth is a problem. No development of infrastructure, promotion of entertainment, personal pleasure, not growth, not development. So the relationship that we see today in Asia, and what Trump just experienced, was what most Americans want. When Donald Trump said that most Americans look to your country with a sense of appreciation and respect for what China has accomplished, that's true. Most Americans do not agree with the Washington Post or the New York Times. They actually hate those institutions. I mean, when Donald Trump and Xi Jinping got together, they probably cracked New York Times jokes. The media is, of course, a problem, and people know the media question as well. So, but the interesting thing is that the culture of Asia represents something distinct. It's not something that Europe doesn't know. The United States was built as a nation according to a pro-growth, pro-development, pro-infrastructure country. We didn't develop as a nation because of free trade or Wall Street. We developed a nation because of people like Hamilton, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt building up industry, infrastructure, science, manufacturing, education, universities, a space program. That's how we developed the United States. Not Wall Street. China is doing the same thing. South Korea built up their nation the same way. Japan similarly. And the Philippines or Vietnam or Thailand or India will all develop the same way. So what's happening with China and the Belt and Road is so very, very important. Because it's a cultural orientation that is the antidote to the crisis facing the United States and the West today. But even more interesting, the financial policies China adopted in the early 1990s are the very financial policies that must be adopted today to address the financial crisis. How many people here know Glass-Steagall? The banking law Glass-Steagall. How many people know China has that as a law? 1993, China adopted banking separation, meaning that if you're going to be an investment bank, you cannot have making investments and brokering into the stock market. You cannot have and hold people's savings accounts. If you hold people's savings accounts, you can make loans to mortgages, you can make loans to businesses, but you can't get involved into the stock market. That's a separate kind of banking. China made that separation. Then in 1994, they set up the 3 policy banks. People know the policy banks? China Development Bank, Export-Import Bank, and then an agricultural bank. They set up 3 banks. These 3 banks began to extend large amounts of credit to the development of China's infrastructure, like high-speed rail, or the Three Gorges Dam. Do you know what China's policy banks, do you know what rate they lend at? Like right now when the China's Export-Import Bank makes a loan to Pakistan, do you know what interest rate they loan at? Take a guess. How many people have a credit card? What's your credit card charge you?
20.
20? 18%? What does China charge Pakistan? Almost, yeah. Some cases it's 0, 0.5%, 1%, 1.5%, maybe 2%. The difference between 2% or say 1% and 10% is like paying over 40 years. This will be rough numbers, but just to give people a sense. If I borrow from you $1,000, I have to pay you back in 40 years. You charge me 1%. I'll probably pay you back about $2,000. After 40 years, I'll pay you back double. if it's at 10% over 40 years, I'll have to pay you back $1 million. By lending at low interest rates, they're making the money become far more physically productive. They're developing nations' infrastructure, power supply, manufacturing, and they're developing people's skills and productivity. If you're lending at 10%, all you do is make a country your slave. That's what the IMF and World Bank, they lend at 10%. JP Morgan lends at, Goldman Sachs will lend at 12% or 15%. It's not viable for the development of nations. That policy was the very policy of Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary of the United States. He set up a national bank, he loaned at low interest rates, and he developed the entire country and paid back all of the war debt we had from the Revolutionary War. Abraham Lincoln used the same policy, Franklin Roosevelt used the same policy, and we have to use the same policy again today. If we establish those policies, which our director, Mr. LaRouche, has prescribed, then we will have not only a chance to address the financial crisis, which we can put out of its misery before it happens. We will establish a policy for development in the United States, but there will be perfect harmony between US and China policy. And that means that mankind will enter a new era. The best of the West and the best of the East in a cultural dialogue of development. That's really the antidote to the crisis we face. It's a financial crisis. It's a political crisis on some level. But it's a cultural crisis. But the solution exists. And because you know it, because you know what's happening in China, you play a very important role in helping your fellow Americans understand what's actually happening and why we can turn this around in the United States, we can develop the country, and working with China, working with Russia, working with India, Japan, these other nations, is the basis for a new economic system that will work for the next 500 years. At least 100, but probably 500. So, those are my opening comments. It's a broad sweep, so there may be questions on many things, or just comments or ideas, and we should open it up for thoughts. So, thank you very much.
Well, perhaps just for the sake of being able to hear, actually, we could just, if anybody has any questions, we can just ask them from the audience, and I can repeat them.
Question, Michael, what was the outcome of the recent conferences with the APEC over in Vietnam, vis-a-vis the road forms in terms of the United States and the other countries?
So just so people can, excuse me, Hal asked what the outcome was of the APEC meeting in Da Nang that just occurred, and the follow through with that.
Yeah, it's good to come back to this. I touched on it at the beginning. There was no direct mention by Donald Trump of the Belt and Road, and some people would hope that there would be. But what you see from, there were a number of specific encounters that President Trump had with President Xi, especially in China. And the warm embrace of Donald Trump towards Xi and towards China, it's not just him being friendly. This has major consequences, because if China doesn't feel, from my impression, and I'm not an expert on China's internal politics by any means, but as I understand it, the difference between Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping's presidencies, Hu Jintao maintained that China would continue to work with the United States and not do anything to disrupt that relationship. That China would play somewhat subservient to US kind of policies. It was almost an unconditional relationship. Xi Jinping came in and said, no, China's going to assert its sovereignty and its rights in a stronger and bolder way. with an idea of development. Donald Trump has fully embraced that with his trip. That reverberates. It reverberates not only for the United States, as we see with the governors, and Governor Inslee, Governor Brown. I was at China Day celebration, China's patriotic day of celebration in San Francisco. Governor Jerry Brown was there. Governor Jerry Brown said, California has joined the One Belt, One Road. He said, I talked to President Xi earlier this year. They put up a picture of them sitting in 2 chairs, having a discussion. He took over like 70 people with him. And they talked about it, and he said, I want California to join the One Belt, One Road. And Xi said, okay. So California has joined the One Belt, One Road. Governors are clamoring to be a part of this. Jerry Brown wants to build that high-speed rail. He wants to build something in California like his father did. His father built up California. He turned California into a powerhouse. Jerry Brown knows that his first governorship, 40 years ago, didn't do much. So, but the only way he's going to get it done is with Chinese help. They're clamoring. So that's for the states. The process in Washington is just so corrupted. It's changing, but it's so corrupted that to be able to work with the state governments is absolutely key. That's happening under Trump's presidency is a big change. But the same thing has been done. Now for Vietnam, or the Philippines, or Thailand. Thailand wants to build, or some people in Thailand want to build a huge canal through the isthmus, this very narrow part of Thailand that goes down to Malaysia. If you built a canal there, then the Malacca Straits near Singapore, which are very congested, would no longer be a problem. You just go right through the canal in Thailand, which is very important for Chinese shipping, for all of Southeast Asia, and for India. If Thailand, or Vietnam, or the Philippines, or any nation no longer have to choose between China and the United States, you can have a relationship and a friendship with both. That changes the entire development perspective of this entire region. And between China, Southeast Asia, and India, you have over 5 billion people out of 7 on the planet. It's the most important part of the world today. So these questions were massive. And of course, it wasn't just Southeast Asia at APEC. Mexico was there, Peru, Chile, Nicaragua, the Central American, and Canada. So the Belt and Road is quickly going to be moving into South America, into Central America as a development orientation. And it's moving into the United States. The problem is that no American knows anything about this. And so it really is a challenge to educate the culture of the country. It's going to move very quickly. There are going to be major changes very quickly. But whatever we can do to develop this, to promote it, at the state level, at local level, at a national level, will make the kinds of changes right now.
When you mentioned about the $48 billion, it's a trade or it's investment in West Virginia?
Yeah, the $80 billion in West Virginia is a specific investment over 20 years, so it's about $4 billion a year on average. And it's an investment into chemical production and shale fracking for natural gas. Chinese investment into West Virginia's capacity for production. There's also a foreign policy expert from Renmin University. He wrote an editorial in Global Times. And he recommended that this is also happening in Germany. There's an old Canadian air base in, there's an old Canadian air base in Germany. So China is going to invest into that to make it a major rail logistics center. So this expert from Renmin University suggested 20% of US military bases today are idle. They're unused and undeveloped. So he says, why doesn't China invest into these areas? Make them logistics centers, make them industrial centers. These are places that are broad land area, would have some population centers around them, but they're very impoverished. So he also proposed a global infrastructure bank set up by the US and China. So the US and China would specifically set up an institution for infrastructure development globally. So people in China realize there's real opportunity to move this. And as more and more American politicians are having to be concerned about their own sexual predatory past, the more likely they're going to want to focus maybe on some of these more positive aspects for the population. So, but that's, yeah.
I only speak for myself, but lots of friends of mine share the same thing. Common Chinese feel the TPP was made, just try to turning a trade war with China. That's why most of Chinese American seems would like to vote Donald Trump this time.
Mm-hmm.
But traditionally Chinese vote for Democrat.
Almost all immigrants do.
Yeah. But this time it's a turnaround.
Yeah.
And the big thing is they think, Democratic Party is really treading the water against the current.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than build this harmonic relationship, they try to start a Cold War again.
Yeah, right.
So, based on the current situation, we have the thought, just a thought, that one day the Democrats come back to power, it will start over again.
Well, that's a very real, it's a very good question. I've talked to a number of the immigrant communities, leadership in the Bay Area, and many of them have said, I actually ran for Congress in San Francisco, I've talked to the Indian community there. Like immigrants, my wife's family immigrated from Vietnam. They're all Democrats because they think the government's there to help bring them in and to develop the country in some way, and to provide some basic means to integrate and to become part of the nation. But everything else the Democratic Party stands for, the hardcore green ideology, which is a depopulation program that tries to make you think it's about plastic bags. The sexual orientations, how many Hispanic, Chinese, Indian, or Middle Eastern immigrants, which is most of the immigrants in the country today from those areas, want their children to have abortion, want their children to be gay, want their children to be open to drugs, want their children to be concerned about population growth in India. It's just not there. So the Democratic Party has been grossly disassociated from reality for a long time. And they have lived off of the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy. And what puts it, I think, the sharpest is we met somebody here in the Washington, Seattle area after the election, or maybe it was before the election. And he said, yeah, I'm voting for Donald Trump. He's the best, he's the only Democrat running. Because it's true. Trump is representing a Franklin Roosevelt Democratic Party orientation, which is what made the Democratic Party what it was. So there is a major sea change. It's massive what's happening to the institutions of the United States. The political parties have lost their credibility. The Republicans are clueless. The Republicans think tax breaks are economic policy. That's the problem, right? The Democrats are becoming the party of the Cold War. And the Republicans still think that simply cutting taxes is going to make the economy function. It just doesn't work. This is sandbox kind of stuff. You have to invest in areas of real production, of real development. That's what's essential. So Donald Trump has an uphill climb inside Washington. But throughout the rest of the country, there's an increasing recognition of this. And so we've got to continue to champion this kind of policy orientation. The most interesting thing about it is that what Vladimir Putin and Russia did in Syria had changed history. Because under Obama, we were supporting terrorists overthrowing a legitimate government. And Putin said, nope. Now you're going to have to shoot down Russian planes. And then they did shoot down a Russian plane. Remember that?
Yeah.
November of 2015. We came very close to World War III. But Putin just kept the course. They've ended they've ended the terrorist war in Syria. It's practically over. And then what Xi Jinping and Putin together have done, Xi Jinping representing an economic program, and Putin representing the strategic one, gave the American people a chance. We've got a chance to pull the country together. We're not getting launched into World War or ongoing regime change wars. And we're actually addressing the economic crisis in our own country. There's a real chance. And I certainly hope we don't miss it. And what's interesting in the context of this discussion is the pending financial crisis. Wall Street is very concerned. Donald Trump identified during the campaign that he knows that this is a financial bubble. I don't think he or anyone else who's looking at it is convinced that because the stock market has gone up 5,000 points, that, oh, the financial bubble is now gone. It's on steroids. The whole thing is a financial bubble in the stock market. The question is having a political culture to address it. And I'll tell you one thing. You take all of Bernie Sanders supporters, all of Donald Trump supporters, you're not going to find too many supporters of Wall Street. And that's probably 70%, 60% of the United States population, political, which is very political. The American people know that Wall Street's a problem. They want changes. They wanted changes under Obama. He didn't give them. He promised everything. He promised the world, but he didn't deliver. The American people want these changes. So our focus within the LaRouche organization, within the Schiller Institute, is to keep a very clear focus on how these policy changes on the financial situation can be adopted. The Glass-Steagall bill that I referenced, the banking separation, that's in Congress. We've got bills in the House, in the Senate. This thing can happen. It can happen very quickly. Donald Trump promised to pass it before he got elected and after. The problem is that everybody else around him doesn't want it to be done. His Treasury Secretary, his economic advisor. So you've got a cultural fight. But it's a very winnable one because the American people, but also the 5 billion people of Asia are all on our side. And that's substantial. Okay, any other questions? Yeah, Hal.
David, the election of Mangadingra in Kirkland, State Legislative District 45, our home district 7, has changed the complex of the Washington legislature so that all of the legislatures of the West Coast and the governorships are all Democrats. And supposedly the blue wall. In view of what Michael has said about the One Belt, One Road, do you think that the time is right for the West Coast to be pursuing this? Because California is working on high-speed rail, and the state of Washington, the Department of Transportation, is finishing the first stage of its high-speed rail study right now. And Oregon did its last year.
Did people hear what Hal had just said? He noted the election, which happens to be in the district that he lives in Kirkland, which is the election of Mangadingra, okay, who was running as a Democrat. That tilted the legislature over to being the Democratic as a majority, which means the so-called blue wall on the west coast of Oregon, California, and Washington all being Democrats. Now, I would somewhat situate, Michael referred to the fact that Jerry Brown in California mentioned this about the One Belt, that California was joining the One Belt, One Road. That was at the China's National Day, the celebration that he was at the San Francisco consulate, or the Chinese consulate in San Francisco. But apparently at that discussion as well, Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington, Walker of Alaska, and also Walker of Oregon, all also gave some indication.
Yeah.
Kate Brown of Oregon all gave a similar endorsement to the One Belt, One Road. Now, as people may or may not have heard, there is a proposal for a high-speed rail from Vancouver to Portland. And the question is could this be sort of used as momentum? I mean, I think it goes back to what Michael was saying on the question of orientation. I know, I know that there are those who promote the idea that, you know, we should just break off of the rest of the universe and form our own Cascadia. You know, we'll just have the environmentalists, the left,
Bruce Agnew
whatever.
approach, right?
Right. You know, which is a dangerous approach. Actually, you guys probably know the name Heineken. You know, the beer, Heineken beer. Yeah. He actually had a whole plan to balkanize the United States that he wrote up. And actually, I think we were called, I don't think it was Cascadia, I think it might have been Ecotopia. I forget what the region, the various regions had different elements to it. But that's a dangerous concept. We need national unity, but it has to be national unity around a principle. And I think what Michael was going through as the, you know, the question of culture, which some people might think, you know, I came to a meeting about the financial collapse and to hear about major projects. What is, you know, strange senators' sex lives have to do with that, right? But the point is, it has to do with the cultural orientation of people that just have given up on any future progress. So I mean, so the question is could this be integrated in, or is this a, you know, some idea that we're going to have our own little isolated enclave of economy that's just going to be a bunch of tech people, you know, tooling back and forth between Portland and Vancouver? Or could it be brought in to the larger concept that Dr. Cooper has worked on, which is you could extend the Belt and Road Initiative up through Siberia, underneath the Bering Strait, come down through Alaska, down through British Columbia, through Seattle, all the way down to Mexico and beyond, in terms of what we have promoted, which is the idea that what China is doing should not be seen as a China project per se. Obviously, they're taking the leadership on it, but this should be for the planet as we are seeing it develop as a planet. So yes, it could be for that, or it could be for some isolated thing. At this point, based on the cost of the project, I'm not sure it's going to go forward.
Well,
But-
it's not going to go forward without the Chinese being involved. But you know, if you've got California, Washington, and West Virginia all solid in the camp, it's impossible now to make things happen.
But there's a lot that's possible,
Michael,
right?
Michael, I didn't know in West Virginia that they had made that arrangement, but I would think Governor Justice would be a very good advocate. Would you agree?
Oh, I think people may not know, but the political process in the United States, most of the U.S. congressmen and women come from the state assemblies. So it's kind of the way the political system works here. We've been, for 40 years, we've organized state legislatures, knowing that the state legislator will soon become a congressman, and they're very close to their current congressman. What's happening in these states, it may not affect all the law firms in Washington or all the financial institutions on Wall Street. But when these states start to see this kind of investment and orientation, that's the way you change the political culture of the United States. This is a major, major shift in the way it's working.
Is Governor Justice going to become an ally of the LaRouche movement?
Well, I don't know. Maybe implicitly he already is.
It sounds like
You know, it's interesting. There's a high-speed rail discussion in California. There's a lot of Republicans who oppose it because they think it's a waste of money. But when you tell them that we're going to build it into Alaska and into Russia and China, they go, now that might be worth something. Because it changes the whole way. It's not some just, you know, the techies and the Hollywood people going from LA to San Francisco. It's now about development of the land area, the resources, the industry, through Western Canada, into Alaska, into Siberia, and their eyes just get big because the growth potential is so big.
Yeah, especially the tourists.
Yeah, yeah.
Does that mean Governor Inslee is likely to become the real leader of this move? Because I can't think of a better advocate of high-speed rail than him.
We're all for it. We're all for it. Okay, we're getting late. It's about time. Are there any other questions people want to ask, or insights or thoughts? Well, I know Dave and I, both from the Schiller Institute, thank everyone for coming. I'm sure the Nanahai does too. Please grab some material from our political process, get a sense of it, leave your name and number. Thanks for calling, and here's Dave.
And also just one last thanks to the Bellevue Chinese Chamber of Commerce for helping out with the refreshments. So, thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah, make sure you get some political.